Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Mike Talbot from UK Mediation with this afternoon's webinar on the psychology of conflict. Delighted that so many people are joining us this afternoon. We've had a few hellos from around the UK and we just had one from South Africa. Great to see so many people joining us from the UK and from around the world on this fine afternoon. To talk about the psychology of conflict. So here we are, let's crack on. My name's Dr. Mike Talbot. I started UK Mediation 21 years ago and we resolve conflict. We resolve conflict in the workplace, in neighbourhoods, within families who are trying to stay together, in businesses, in boardrooms, in committees, charities, everywhere we resolve conflict. And my background is as a psychotherapist, so I've come from the field of psychotherapy into conflict resolution, bringing some lessons and some ideas around how we work in therapy and trying to apply that to how we work as mediators. So we've been going for 21 years, headquarters in Derbyshire, which is where I am this afternoon, and looking at the chat box on YouTube, everybody's comparing how sunny it is where they are, so it's not too bad here, a bit cloudy. But hopefully warm enough to get out in the garden a bit later on. So shall we get on? We have a webinar for you this afternoon, which I'll be talking for about 50 minutes. We'll leave a bit of time at the end for Q&A. And for today, we're talking about psychology of conflict, in particular, looking at a relational model of conflict, taking a focus on the relationships that people have. And what can go on within those relationships. And within the webinar, we're talking about what is a relational model, why is it important, and introducing our own relational model, which is called Retalk. It's something that we've put together over the years, based on the company's 21 years of experience. My own experience in mediation is about 1,200 cases over the last 21 years, and I've been sort of keeping an eye on what happens. And reflecting on this, including in my doctoral work, and coming up with the model that we call Retalk. I'm going to introduce that, talk about how mediation works within that model, and why a relational model helps. So there's a lot of different ways of approaching mediation. The field is sort of burgeoning, and different people bring different things into the field. From my own point of view, I'm looking at the psychology of relationships and why a relational model helps. So let's talk about what that is. What is a relational model? Well, it's a theory or model, in my case partly borrowed from Gestalt psychotherapy, in which we see conflict as a rupture in a relationship. So it's a loss of psychological contact between two or more people, where the relationship breaks down or becomes broken, and there's a sense in which the two parties lose the dialogue that they would otherwise have. So instead of having a healthy dialogue and a healthy psychological contact, something else happens. So the benefit of having a relational model is that we can explain what's happening when conflict develops, and especially explain what happens when conflict deepens, and then to make some predictions and assumptions about what happens in conflict when we restore the psychological contact by conflict resolution. So the idea of a model is to explain what's happening. And also the model acknowledges that conflict doesn't happen in a vacuum. So we're looking at a relationship between two or more people. We'll just concentrate mostly on two people for this afternoon. But conflict depends on where you are and who else is around, put very bluntly. So somebody that you get on with in your squash club or chess club or book club, you might not get on with them if you were working with them, or somebody that you live next door to, you may get on with them perfectly well. But perhaps you wouldn't get on with them in a different setting. So the context is important, who else is around is important, the sort of history and expectations we have about other people and about ourselves are all important as well. So the idea of a relational model drawn from Gestalt theory is that whilst it's largely about the psychological contact between two individuals, we can't say that any conflict happens in a vacuum. It all depends on a context, who's around and what the external pressures are. So let's start to take a bit of a look at sort of a diagrammatic idea around relationship. We're going to look at a working relationship, so within a workplace. What we've got here are two people, the dark hair and the light hair person, who are having dialogue. They've got a decent working relationship. There are people outside of their relationship. We can see at the bottom there, the little heads. So what's happening within a healthy relationship is that there is dialogue. So the two parties are able to talk, exchange ideas, exchange thoughts and feelings. They can give and accept support and challenge. So a healthy relationship is not one where it's always cozy. You know, sometimes there is challenge, sometimes there's disagreement. Often we give support to one another, sometimes we give challenge. And I think it's that balance of support and challenge for me that represents a healthy relationship. And our way of looking at conflict here at UK Mediation is that it's a healthy agent for change. So conflict brings about innovation, it brings about new ideas, it brings about initiatives that perhaps wouldn't have arisen had there been no conflict and if everybody was agreeing with everybody all the time. So for us, normal means having some support and some challenge, and the kind of relationship that we see illustrated there is where there is this healthy dialogue that's characterised by both support and challenge. Two parties in a healthy relationship, they're interacting with each other, they're interacting with those around them. So the people down the bottom of the diagram there might be colleagues, they might be friends outside of work, it might be the HR department or management within work. So there's interaction with people outside of the immediate relationship. We're looking at the relationship between dark hair and light hair there, and thinking of the fact that actually, yeah, sure, there are external agents around as well, and they do interact with those people as well. So the reason for setting all of that up is then to show you a little bit of video, just a few seconds actually, of a working relationship between two individuals. So we have a very quick setup here between two workers. We've got Sally, who will appear on your left, and Heather, who will appear on your right, who work in a plumbing supplies company. There's some history here. Heather on the right alleges that Sally only got the job because of her friendship with the manager. There's a little bit of a frostiness about that. And the two of them clearly have different styles, different ways of approaching the work. And what we're going to see is just a brief cameo of a little interaction between Heather and Sally. So I'll let you watch that, and then we'll reflect on that afterwards.
Hi Liz, yeah, it's nice to talk to you. Yeah, I was just ringing to find out what time we're going to meet for the theatre on Tuesday. Yeah. We go for about 1:30. Perfect. Yeah, it'd be fantastic to see you then. Oh, actually, do you want to go for a coffee first? That would be great.
Oh, for God's sake, it's not like it's even dinner time or anything.
Yeah, 1:30, Liz. Yeah, that'll be absolutely fine. Okay. All right. Bye. What are you doing at the weekend?
Nothing special.
Oh, we're going out with Phil. It's his birthday. Do you know Phil from sales?
Yeah.
It's his 50th. Would you like to come along?
No, it's all right. It's not really my kind of thing.
Oh, it's his 50. You should really enjoy yourself. Come on, you're fantastic time if you come.
Look, I said no, I don't want to go. We've got this important report to get finished. Perhaps we should be getting on with that instead of organising our social life.
Well,
So there we see the working relationship between Sally and Heather, which is not a comfortable one. Maybe they got different objectives, different approaches to work, certain things that one another does that are a bit irritating to the other. And what we can see is that the relationship is beginning to be ruptured by conflict. So I use this word, a rupture in relationship, to talk about this kind of brick wall that you see on the diagram there that begins to get built. So it's not solid yet, but there is some barrier to them having clear psychological contact and a sort of a clean dialogue. So what's happening here is that we have a sort of a slight breakdown or incompatibility between these two parties' needs or goals or priorities. And this is generally speaking at the heart of conflict. So it's not just in workplaces where we see in the psychology of what goes on in between people. It might be with your neighbour, it might be in a commercial setting, it might be in a business setting, on a board of directors, on a committee, it may be within your family. So there's some incompatibility about needs or goals or priorities, and that's clearly the case in the Sally and Heather conflict there. These things become incompatible. So we start to get the construction of a still permeable wall, so a wall with some holes in it. And the dialogue proceeds in a rather more, laboured way. Metaphorically there we see Heather putting her headphones in to try and block the noise coming from Sally. And this is sort of indicative of that wall. So what's happening around the outside there is where we were having healthier interaction with people outside of the immediate relationship. What's now happening as well is that as the communication starts to break down, these friends, colleagues, possibly management, possibly HR, start to take sides and form factions. So we do know that when people in an organisation start to have conflict, others get interested. So the forming of factions, so Heather or Sally might be speaking to their friends or colleagues, selected colleagues, break time, at lunchtime, texting them, speaking to them on the way home, and those parties would be making judgments about that conflict. And this tends to be what happens in the early stages of a workplace conflict, is that both sides will line up their factions and would tend to agree with one or the other. Of course, we get a lot of very selective interaction here, so the selective interaction would be people making judgments about who's right or wrong, just filtering out information that doesn't support their view, that maybe Sally's in the right or maybe Heather's in the right. But in all of these ways, what happens is that people take sides and will tend to make judgments about who's right and who's wrong. So that's sort of what tends to happen within the beginning of the workplace relationships, just starting to break down, just starting to be ruptured by conflict. And if we just take a moment to reflect there, I often get asked, at what point should you be intervening with mediation? Well, I suppose just around about this point, what's starting to happen is that they're not able to deal with everyday challenges. If they have a small disagreement, it might be that this is not easy to sort out. Quite often, people who are skilled and confident enough can address any minor disagreements or fallouts between themselves. But kind of when we get to this point or just after this point, that's when maybe there's a little bit of management support needed in order to help these two guys to communicate better. I wouldn't say necessarily you need mediation or any third party intervention here outside of the organisation, but perhaps trusted colleagues or management might notice what's going on between these two parties, and at this point perhaps lend a bit of support to trying to facilitate the working relationship between these two guys. So in terms of the question, when do we get involved with mediation? I would say not quite yet, but perhaps there's some support needed to help these two people to communicate better. So let's go on and have a look at the next bit of the story between Heather and Sally. Just a few more seconds of video as the two of them meet in a different setting, and things go from slightly bad to slightly worse.
Oh, has she had a second baby yet? Oh, that's lovely. She had a little boy. What's she called him? Oh, that's really nice. Hold on a minute.
Sorry to interrupt. How's your part of the report going?
Yeah, getting it done.
Do you think you'll have it done by tonight? Only I've got mine finished and I need to work yours into it.
By tomorrow. Yes, hi Ruth. Sorry for the interruption.
Sorry, Sally, I've not finished.
Sorry Ruth, I'll have to ring you back.
You've been on the phone for nearly 20 minutes. You could be doing your report then.
I'm
before
on the
that, you
phone
had a break.
to Ruth from Albright.
Well, it doesn't sound like it. You was on for at least 20 minutes and before that having a break.
Is that right? That's the crux of it, isn't it? You are constantly monitoring when I go for my break. You think you're in charge, well you're not. You're always evaluating what I'm doing and timing when I have my breaks. I've had enough of it.
No, I don't. You're just being bloody childish now. For God's sake, can you just get your part of the work done? I've had enough of this. You're an absolute nightmare. I'm going to have to speak to James.
So here's the point where perhaps they definitely need some support. So they're turning away from each other. They're conspicuously getting other parties involved. There's shouting. There's a bit of a name call there. We're at the point where there perhaps needs to be some taking these two guys aside and having a word. So they're at the point now where it's become rather attacking. And in the psychology of it, I think that what's happening here is that the dispute is developing. So that brick wall now has become less permeable, and there's certainly a barrier of communication between the two. You can imagine the environment getting rather more hostile, rather more frosty between these two guys, and that the relationship would start to become quite fragile. So any little thing now is likely to confirm their negative view of one another. So this is what tends to happen in a lot of disputes. Again, wherever it is, within families, between neighbours, in workplaces, boardrooms, committees, no matter where it is. So what's happening is that they're both making assumptions now about the other's motives and mindset. You're like this, you're always like that, you're never like that. And we start to get this very negative expectation about the other person's behaviour, which there's various ways of talking about that. One thing that we talk about from therapy is about projection. So the projection is starting to guess what another person is thinking. You're always thinking this, you're always thinking that. So we can see in the video there, Sally starts to form quite a negative view about Heather's motivations. She believes she's been scrutinised by Heather. She believes that Heather's checking up on her and trying to micromanage her and scrutinise her. And from the other way around, you know, Heather sees Sally as being a bit lazy, a bit profligate, a bit too ready to have conversations rather than getting on with the work, not dedicated to the task. This is how Heather's seeing it. So they're making guesses and projections about the other's motives and mindset. And where that word comes from, the projection idea, is, you know, picture a blank projection screen, you know, on the face of another party. And it's what you yourself project onto that screen is your guess about what's going on internally with that party. So you're guessing what's going on inside somebody else's head, and you're projecting onto their blank screen your own thoughts and expectations about where they're coming from. So what happens here is that, as we're seeing there with Heather and Sally, is they start to see the other as all bad. So Heather sees Sally as all lazy and all uncommitted, too ready to chat and not get on with the job, whereas Sally sees Heather as being rather vindictively scrutinising of Sally's work. She feels as if she's been watched and checked up on and been negatively judged. So we get this judgment about one another. Cognitive dissonance is about us forming conclusions and then only looking for evidence that confirms our conclusions. Cognitive dissonance is about us being reluctant to admit we make mistakes. So perhaps these two guys are making a mistake about each other. They're not really seeing each other clearly, but now they're starting to look for evidence to confirm that. And the other phrase that we hear a lot is confirmation bias. There's lots about these things on the internet. If you Google either of those terms, you'll find quite a lot of stuff. And this is where the relationship really starts to go wrong, is where they're just filtering out any information that would change their mind about the other party and only filtering in that which confirms their thesis or judgment about the other person. So we're now at a bad place. And the dialogue is very poor, it becomes quite competitive, there's a standoff, and what might happen is that they're going to go and get other people involved. There are tight-lipped exchanges between the two parties. You can imagine they're going to walk past each other in the corridor now, or see each other in the car park, and there's going to be looks exchanged. It might be a bit tight-lipped, so they stop having a proper conversation about stuff. Instead of going aside and saying, hey, you know what, let's clear the air, let's get this sorted out, things go unsaid. And that other word down there, retroflected, this is about things being unsaid. And you can see on the diagram there those sort of loops that come from people's heads and loop back to their ears. This is about retroflection, which, as the name implies, something that needs to be said but there's not getting said. So we have this situation where they're projecting, they're guessing each other's motives and mindset. There's this dissonance or confirmation bias where they're selecting out any information that would change their view about the other party from negative to positive. And there are things going unsaid or retroflected where they're not having a proper conversation. There's just a rather tight-lipped, frosty, and you know, things are going unspoken, as it were. So what we see now is the wall is really built up. They turn away from each other. There's all this retroflection going on, and they would seek to get HR and management involved, or sometimes other colleagues. So Heather's gone storming off to speak to James, the manager, to get the big guys involved. James, the manager, has a chat with the two of them. He's done this quite a few times before with these two. There's been some frostiness in the past, and now he's going to have a, turn his sort of refer this situation to a mediator. So we're going to look in a second at what happens when a mediator gets involved. But just to pause for a moment again and thinking about this question, which I do often get asked, at what point should we get the mediator involved? I would say that when management and local resource, HR or team leader or trusted colleagues have had a go at facilitating the dialogue between these two parties. And when we're at this point, you know, as long as you've tried everything around facilitated conversations or resolution meetings, and you get to this point still, rather than it getting much worse, it might be a good idea to use the organisation's mediators, or sometimes to bring a mediator in from the outside. So I would say definitely at this point where there's a brick wall between them, where it's this competitive, where there's a lot of mind reading and where there's a lot of confirmation bias, there's some support needed at this stage. So let's take a look at what happens when the mediator intervenes. So there's lots of different ways of doing this. We do this within our relational model of retalk, which has worked very well for us over the last 21 years, something that we've developed. So this is a way of thinking about what happens when the mediator gets involved. So I'll do a little bit of explaining about the diagram. So there's the mediator at the top, the faceless mediator. We could have drawn a nose and a couple of eyes on him, I reckon. But there he is. And he's starting to get involved. We've got the two parties turned away from each other, still retroflecting, looking at, you know, we're looking at trying to restore the dialogue between them. First thing we do is we set up this safe container. So the dotted line around there, this is temporarily insulating people from their factions, and it's important that this container, it's a term that we use in psychotherapy, is set up. So it's that safe container which is defined by having an agreement about confidentiality, by having people explicitly contract to take part in mediation, by having people volunteer for the process. So the safety is engendered by the voluntariness, by the confidentiality, and by the impartiality of the mediator. So all the factions around the outside that would otherwise be geeing people up to say this, go and say that, oh, you're not going to let her get away with this, don't let her get away with that, or people making judgments about who's right or wrong. We want to insulate the process from that for the time that we're trying to do the mediation. So mediator's there, mediator is impartial, we've got an explicit agreement about confidentiality, we've got an explicit agreement that they are volunteering for this process, and this is what sets up the safe container so that we insulate the two parties from their factions and from the external context for the time being. And then, again, I'm sort of thinking at the back of my mind all the questions that we often get about mediation. One of them that we get is, you know, what's the objective? What's the intention in mediation? Well, here we're trying to rebuild dialogue. So we're trying to get people to say things that they otherwise would not say. So in the jargon that I'm using here, we're undoing retroflexion. We want to set up a situation where people speak openly and honestly to each other and that there be no consequence to that. We can't have a free-for-all, so obviously there's got to be some rules, and that in itself would help to set up that safe container. So the mediator's objective initially is to help people to say the unsayable and to begin to rebuild dialogue that way. And in terms of the way that we're looking at this in the relational model, we're trying to restore the psychological contact between the two parties. We want people to change their minds about the other. We can't make it happen, but we can set up the conditions by which that does happen, and that the parties get a clearer view of each other so that they're not projecting these negative expectations onto one another the whole time. And in that way we can replace the competition with collaboration. So instead of them banging their heads together trying to prove who's right and who's wrong, what we want to do is to get them to put their heads together, withdraw the projections, see each other more clearly, collaborate rather than compete. It's not about who's going to win, it's about getting the two of them to take some shared responsibility for making this situation and the relationship better, so that you know, that they can get on without the support of the mediator. So our intention is to get the dialogue going again, to say the unsayable. It's to have them get a clearer view of each other so they change their minds about the other person, withdraw the projections and get them pulling together in a collaborative relationship rather than banging their heads together in a competitive relationship. So that's the initial setup. So let's have a think about the process and how the process would proceed with initially separate meetings between the mediator and each party. So we're still kind of keeping them separate. They're both volunteered for the mediation, and we've noticed something that happens when A finds out that B is willing to come to mediation. Quite often it softens a little bit their view of each other, and when B finds out that A is prepared to come into mediation, it would soften her view of the other. Knowing that the other person is prepared to walk towards a process that's intended to restore the working relationship between parties, sort of changes people's view of the other one. They think, oh, well, they're committed to it, are they? That's interesting. Let's give that a go then. So even just the introduction of mediation can help, and they begin to turn slightly, very slightly, their attention towards the other party just a little bit. So we've still got these curly arrows, which is the retroflections, things going unsaid. We've still got the safe container with other people being kept outside of the process. The brick wall is still there, albeit there's a bit of potential for finding holes in the wall. The mediator's job is to remain impartial and to build rapport with each party separately. So the mediator meets with dark hair, mediator meets with fair hair, to build some rapport and trust and to encourage offloading. Early part of mediation, it's got a lot to do with active listening and a bit of reframing, empathic responding, so that parties can get things off their chest, have a good old rant in private, in a place where their colleague can't hear them. Mediator soaks it up. Mediator is there to try and get into each party's frame of reference equally. This is what the impartiality is all about. So as mediators, we're not sitting on the fence and being indifferent. What we're doing is trying to invest ourselves in each side's interests and reality and frame of reference, and to do that equally engenders that impartiality. So we support the parties to become aware of what's going on, and also to think about, okay, what's needed, what's needed, what's needed. So the self-awareness is a way of, you can think about it as the mediator holding a mirror up to each party, just so that they can see where they are in the conflict, what their own thoughts, feelings and actions are, and to have some reflection on, perhaps how they got there, but more importantly, how they're going to move beyond the conflict as well. So some of the work we do in the early individual meetings is about helping people to really hear themselves telling their own story. It's about each party giving their own differing narrative about how they reckon they've got to the current point, and just hearing themselves say it, and to get some empathy off the mediator and get some reflection from the mediator, so that the parties can be more able to make choices. If we don't have self-awareness, we behave compulsively. I think this is an important thing, both for psychotherapy and for mediation and conflict resolution in general, is that we tend to behave in a rather reactive, knee-jerk way unless we have a good degree of self-awareness about what's going on for us. So the early part of mediation is to try and engender that self-awareness so people can make different choices about how they behave. And also to switch the focus from the past to the future helps parties to, I suppose, get off the hook a little bit, and to think about, okay, so that's how we got here, so what are we going to do from now? As they do that separately with the mediator, hopefully what usually happens, is they regain a little bit of curiosity about the other, or about the relationship with the other, so that then they become prepared to risk having a direct exchange with the other party. And I say risk because it's quite a scary thing to do, to come into a joint meeting with a third-party impartial mediator, a stranger, and have a conversation that's maybe a long time overdue. It's quite a scary thing. So they do become prepared to risk coming into that direct exchange, that direct dialogue with the other, hopefully with support of the mediator and by building up some trust and rapport with the mediator. Quick question. Oh, okay. I like to take the questions as we go along rather than save them up to the end. From Ali by email, who says, why is it that people get so entrenched in conflict when the solution seems to be so obvious? I think what goes on, Ali, it's a great question. I think it's to do with shame. I think it's to do with loss of dignity. I think it's to do with loss of face. And I think that once you start to paint yourself into a corner in a conflict, it's very hard to come out of that corner. Once you've taken up a position, and maybe once you've been involved in some critical incidents with the other individual, such as the shouting match that we saw in the kitchen there between Sally and Heather, I think then, without losing face or without getting ashamed really about your own behaviour, I think we sort of lock ourselves into our castle. You lock yourself into your castle, you take up a position in the conflict, you get people to back you up, and this is what gets us entrenched. Sometimes to an external third party, the solution looks obvious. Always it isn't. So, you know, when we're doing more like arbitration or settlement conferencing, you know, where the practitioner will give a solution, it's not something that we do around here. Other organisations do it. Giving that solution, for me, okay, people walk away with a shrug. And if it's around a purely financial or commercial matter, maybe that will do in terms of a commercial settlement. But it doesn't attend to the relationship. And I think to attend to the relationship, we need to acknowledge that actually it's quite a, it can be quite a shaming thing to back down. So people, I think, Ali, get so entrenched because of that and because of the loss of face by backing down. But it's a great question. Question from Bill. Let's take that one as well. So Bill, as an external mediator, if you're brought in after in-house efforts have failed, how do you ensure you don't go over too much old ground and inflame emotions even more? Well, I think the thing about it is, good question, Bill, thanks very much. The thing about it is that we do need to have some idea about the narrative from both parties about how they got to the current point. So if unfortunately somebody has tried and failed to resolve it internally, we bring in an external agent, we do need to go over some of the old ground. So you know, it's important that we do have the offloading and the what's the word, the narrative of how you believe you got to the current point. Without that, I think it's hard for people to move on. And I think the empathic response from the mediator is really important, to notice how people have been affected by the conflict. If they've already done that internally, then we do actually have to redo that, I'm afraid, with the external mediator. Once or twice when our mediators have been into situations, parties do arrive with a bit of a roll of the eyes and say, oh no, have I got to go through all this again? But we are generally speaking successful in mediation, so I think it's a method that works, albeit it is a bit unfortunate if they have to be recycling the same old material. But I think unfortunately, Bill, we've got to do it. We need to understand how people perceive that they got to the point where they're at. And another one from Katarzyna. I'm sorry if I got your name wrong, Katarzyna Grabka. How do you manage extreme emotions such as direct anger or crying? Do you provide a breakout room? I do, we do, Kat, I'll call you. But I think, you know, conflict is really upsetting. It's a process that will produce sadness and frustration and anger in people, and it's about the mediator having broad enough shoulders to be able to soak it up. And I think you know, having done this for a long time, and our own mediators who are, you know, vastly experienced and done it for a long time, we're not frightened of the strong emotion. And I think if people want to express through tears or whatever other way to express their sadness and frustration and anger at each other, we've got to allow that and make that happen. We need some rules, of course, so we can't have anything that's personally abusive between the parties or anything that's persecutory. We try and get people to take it in turns to speak and make sure they're hearing each other, but quite often, to rebuild the interpersonal bridge, they need to see how the other party is affected by the conflict, which can include, you know, seeing the other party express that frustration through tears or raised voices or whatever other physical expression that they choose to bring. Sometimes, though, yes, we need breakout rooms, but I wouldn't use the breakout room as a place for people to hide. I think we're coming in to this safe container purposefully so that they can express strong emotion, and I think it's important that they both witness one another's, the impact on one another, and witness how the other person is being affected by what's gone on. So, great questions. Let's move on. So we're going into a joint session. We're trying now to support the dialogue between the two parties. So the mediator's attention, that blue arrow at the top, is on this wall which is starting to erode. So this is, if you like, the in-between. This is the interpersonal bridge between the two parties, and the mediator supports the dialogue between the two parties. What starts to happen in the joint session is that, having spoken with the mediator separately and privately, they're now encouraged to have more of a direct dialogue between the two of them. So they're not going to agree about the past, and I think this is a mistake that's made by you know, when we're doing when people do settlements conferencing, or it's sometimes called civil mediation, you know, trying to get an agreement about what's happened up to this point. Not a chance. There can be a shared narrative of what's going on, which is a little bit of overlap about, okay, I did this, you did that, we said this, we said that, this happened, that happened. But really, you know, sometimes it's about integrating their different narratives, of accepting that they're not going to agree about the past, and that we have to integrate these two different stories about how we got here. However, what's more important than that is that they are, you know, prepared to express their own real needs, which is to come back to that question there for Katarzyna, about, you know, expressing their own real needs, which might involve the tears, it might involve the strong emotional offloading, and to be receptive to each other with the encouragement and support of the mediator, and provided, you know, that trust has been built up with the mediator, they're expressing their own real needs, being receptive to one another, and getting to the point where they start to see one another more clearly and start to say what really needs to be said. So those curly arrows that we saw on the heads of dark hair and light hair, they're now being stretched out into a dialogue. So instead of hanging on to things that need to be said, they are expressing what needs to be said. Instead of projecting, instead of just imagining what's in the other person's head, they're hearing what's in the other person's head. So we get this direct expression of that other person's thoughts and feelings, so that they can see the other person more clearly, and so that they can be seen more clearly as well. So just to come back to that jargon that I used earlier, you know, we're undoing retroflexion. So things that would otherwise be swallowed down in a rather tight-lipped way are now getting expressed out there. So the you know, the idea is that we get that dialogue going, supported by the mediator, the wall starts to erode, and we get a you know, more thorough exchange between the two parties, to the point where that dialogue begins to get restored. So the wall has gone, the mediator starts to recede, the dialogue starts to happen, and I'm not suggesting this means that they are now in a cosy living relationship. The important thing here is that we've got, you know, the dialogue happening, albeit it might be a little bit uncomfortable and still a little bit tight-lipped. So the dialogue begins to be restored. We get to a place where the mediator begins to withdraw a little. So the mediator's job and role in the joint mediation session is to hear from both parties equally, support both parties equally, encourage the direct expression, encourage the response from both parties equally, again maintaining their impartiality. And then once that dialogue gets going, the mediator starts to withdraw a little and have the parties have the dialogue directly instead of going through the mediator. That engenders a greater sense of collaboration as they try to rebuild their relationship, and so we're moving away from competition into collaboration, and we're still keeping people outside of the safe container. So the idea is still that this is happening within the safe container that's being engendered by the confidentiality, by the voluntary participation, and by the mediator's impartiality. So this starts to happen now, that the dialogue builds up to the point where hopefully mediation ends successfully. Mediation's ending successfully in this diagram, so the word environment refers to people and processes outside of the two individuals' relationship. But what happens now is that the mediator's gone. There's a little dip in the safe container, so, you know, mediation has happened and we can't forget that it's happened, and the parties certainly won't forget that it's happened, but the dialogue having been restored, they are integrating their different goals and priorities, or they're agreeing new goals and priorities. So they start to get it together a little bit better, and they return to better dialogue. The relationship will be damaged by what's gone on between them. We can't pretend that's not the case. And mediation isn't intended to make people friends or to skip off into the sunset together. That's just an unrealistic objective. But what we can do is get them back to the point where they, you know, they have either a new shared set of goals and priorities, or at least they agree to put behind them the fact that they've had this conflict around those differing goals and priorities. So the factionalism with people outside of their relationship, that begins to dissolve a bit. Supporters, there's a weird thing that happens, which is supporters can sometimes be disappointed that the conflict is finished. I've certainly heard it in a number of organisations where people have said, well, the conflict is more interesting than the work itself. So those who would fan the flames of somebody else's conflict are a bit disappointed. They go, oh, right, you've settled that, have you? Oh, okay. They don't have their own champion anymore. They don't have somebody that they can support in this often well discussed battle between fair hair and light hair. So the supporters kind of go, all right, that's over then. We'll have to turn our attention somewhere else. And the third thing is that they then begin to re-engage more positively. So as the relationship starts to work again, there can be a sense of everybody's a bit relieved, really. They don't hear shouting in the kitchen, which is good. So although there's that bit of disappointment, they're quite glad it's over, because it can be quite toxic having this sort of conflict in an organisation. Draws other people in, we get into factions, we get into sides. So it's, it's over. And that's it's a good thing for the whole organisation, of course. Now, mediation doesn't always work. Various times I've seen various percentage rates for the success of mediation. People saying, yeah, our mediation is successful 90% of the time, 94% of the time, 98% of the time. I've seen somebody say, actually, it's successful all the time. No, it isn't. It does sometimes fail, and there's all sorts of reasons why it might fail. But if it fails, what's happened is that in spite of the best efforts of the mediator, the parties remain out of psychological contact. They remain turned away from each other. They remain in contact with their factional supporters, as we can see in this diagram. The wall remains impermeable. They continue to retroflect. So all those things that are going unsaid remain unsaid, so that they still have these very negative expectations of one another. And even though they've tried mediation, if it's failed, they go, well, typical. I knew it wouldn't work. I knew she wouldn't do this. I knew she wouldn't do that, etc. So unfortunately, what can happen is that they use the mediation process as another way of proving, their negative view of the other party. In my experience, the reasons why we have this is either it's gone on too long, and to come back to the earlier comments about entrenchment, they've got dug in too deeply and or got too many other people involved, or the mindset is not such that they're volunteering for the mediation. They may feel as if they've been forced into it, or they may feel as if the relationship is not worth it. So there's lots of reasons that we could go into as well, but things remain unsaid. We can see the retroflection arrows around the two people's heads, and they retain their lack of interest in each other, so they have no particular motivation to try and mend the relationship. Things remain unsaid, the negative expectations remain in place, and they remain out of psychological contact. And unfortunately, what also happens around the outside is the factional supporters continue to have their own champion and to maintain this rather negative view of the other party. Okay, I'm just going to turn to questions. So Bill says, if your efforts fail, should you still invoice the client? Oh yes, there's a short answer to that one. Katarzyna, I'm really sorry for pronouncing your name wrong. As an RJ worker, we often use two mediators to facilitate a joint meeting. Do you think it might be more beneficial to have two in a mediation session too? Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think it's a good idea. Not a bad idea at all. The only negative to it is that sometimes the parties can feel a little overwhelmed by having two practitioners in front of them, but I think 4 ears are better than 2. So in a lively joint mediation session, I think 2 mediators who work well together can manage that session in a much in a very effective way. And certainly from my own experience, over the many years I've been doing this, I've grown into the idea of doing co-mediation, as we call it. So working with another trusted mediator, I enjoy it. I really enjoy it. Doing it together with somebody else. And I think particularly, if there are issues of difference as well between the parties. So if there are allegations of, for example, discriminatory language, down lines of, say, gender, just to have one male mediator there with a male and female participant, it can feel a bit wrong. So sometimes if there are allegations of, for example, sexually discriminatory language or low-level sexual harassment or sexist treatment one way or the other between a male and female participant, it might be good to have a male and female mediator. And there are arguments for that. So I would say, in short, yeah, have 2 mediators if you can. Nothing wrong with that at all. So here's where mediation fails, oh dear. So in the minority, great minority, small minority of cases, the parties remain out of psychological contact. Their negative expectations are reinforced really. Things that remain unsaid, and the supporters remain in, in this factional process of just sort of supporting their own champion in the negative view of the other party. Okay, so I said I talked for about 45 minutes, so we're close on that now. What I want to say about that is, this idea of a relational model. Now, it's a long way from what we see with some of the practice in conflict resolution in the UK and in some other places I've been in the world as well. There has become this term civil mediation, which it's been adopted mostly by legal practitioners. It's a perfectly valid process, and I've got no issue with it or with people that practice it. It's not mediation, in my view. It's a process of evaluative settlement conferencing with a bit of whispered legal opinion. And there are bodies that have been created around civil mediation and so on, which, is fine. It's an aspect of legal practice, to my mind. And what we do as mediators is a million miles from that. So I'm talking about taking a relational view of conflict resolution. It's a long, long way from this process of civil mediation, which is really just evaluative settlement conferencing, a quasi-legal process. It uses some of the language of mediation, but for me it's not mediation at all. Whereas what we've got here within this relational model, I'm not saying that retalk is the only one, there are other models, but the idea is that we're restoring dialogue, repairing relationships, and it applies to more than just one-to-one conflicts as well. So I've not gone into anything about teams here today. We have done a different webinar in the past about teams, but this same model can be used in rebuilding teams of people too. So the idea with a relational model like retalk is to restore dialogue, repair relationships, rebuild teams, a long way from sort of this quotes civil mediation unquotes process. So those of you who maybe from a legal background looking at this might think, what's this all about? It's a long way from that kind of practice. Why is it important to have this kind of thing? Well, for me to have a theoretical model, and coming from where I do from psychotherapy, there's a lot of emphasis and prominence put on the theoretical model. If a therapist meets another therapist in a pub, don't worry, it's not a joke coming. The first question would be, what's your theoretical model? And there are many, but for me, if you've got a model, you can explain why you do what you do, and I think there's an absence of that in the mediation field. I think there's a process that people follow, there's a series of steps and stages that a lot of people would all use, but if you ask most people to explain why they do what they do, there's blank faces, I'm afraid. So theoretical model, you can explain why you do what you do, and I also think that knowing where conflict comes from helps you to resolve it. So our emphasis here at UK Mediation is that if you can understand the people who are in dispute, then you can better resolve that dispute. So an understanding of the people is really important, and just having some notion about the psychology of what goes on in conflict, what goes wrong in relationship, how dialogue breaks down, it helps us to be able to design systems and mediation approaches that better help us to resolve it. And I think the additional thing, as I've mentioned here today, is that conflict doesn't happen in a vacuum. And I think this sort of an approach acknowledges the impact of context and of external actors. So, where you are makes a big difference to whether you're going to come into conflict with a certain individual and the actions of external people as well, be it colleagues, friends, HR, management, team leaders. That will influence whether conflict gets better or worse as well. And I think it's worth acknowledging that. And the other thing as well, to come back to questions at the back of my mind that people have asked over the years. One is a very pertinent question: what does a mediator add? And I think this kind of an approach begins to answer that question and to say, yeah, here's what the mediator adds to the conflict resolution process. He or she is there to create that safe container, to build up a trusting, empathic rapport with the individual parties, to allow the offloading and the catharsis, and then to provide a process by which dialogue can start to be restored. There's a lot more to it in terms of what the mediator does, but we're creating a very safe space in which parties can realise the impact of their own words and behaviours on the other individual. That could be reciprocated in the other direction as well, where by having a brief empathic relationship with the mediator, they can start to get some empathy between one another as well, the two parties. And I think this is what the mediator adds to the process, is to set up the conditions by which this can happen. And finally, I think this kind of a model, it allows some insight into why mediation does or doesn't work. So on those rare occasions when it doesn't work, we're able to say, okay, I think, we can better understand why mediation didn't work on this occasion. And that helps us to continually develop as mediators. So when we announced the webinar, I had a few questions from outside, as well as the great questions we've had in the chat box. Thank you very much. So what kind of an approach is it? So in terms of some of the sort of jargon you might have heard in the mediation field, this sort of an approach is transformative and facilitative. So transformative means rebuilding relationships. Facilitative is about problem solving. And it's fair to say that mostly the work we do in restoring relationships is transformative, but occasionally they want a bit of help to figure out a problem. So the two parties are looking at each other and wondering, okay, so what are we going to do about X? What are we going to do about Y? So there's a little bit of facilitation skills comes into the model to help people sometimes to attend to solving a problem. We're not giving solutions, we're not suggesting or proposing, which is the kind of thing that might happen in this civil mediation thing. We're not going that far down the road. We are transformative, we're facilitative. We're certainly not doing any of this evaluative settlement conferencing. So hopefully that's an answer to what type of approach it is. Can the model be used online? You bet. That's what we've been doing for the last 3 months. So we call it Reconnect. This is taking Retalk online. We've done loads and loads and loads of online mediation over the last few months. Amazing how many cases have come out of the woodwork, cases where people would not have probably come face to face with the other party, but because it's online, it feels safer, it feels more insulated, and parties have been more inclined to walk towards mediation. So you bet, Retalk can be taken online, and we've been doing a lot of it. We call it Reconnect. A couple more FAQs. What sort of conflicts? Well, we've had successes with everything. Workplace, families who are trying to stay together, neighbourhood and tenancy disputes, a lot of medical disputes. It's become a bit of a specialism of mine, is working with medical conflict. All sorts of complaints and all sorts of business and commercial disputes. The only thing we don't do is family mediation, and again that has become more of by which I mean divorcing and separating couples. So we do family stuff where it's about relationships where families are trying to stay together. What we don't do is the quasi-legal process for couples who are divorcing or separating. That's sailed off more into the realms of legal practice, again along with this civil mediation thing. So we're not lawyers, and we don't intend to be so. So we don't do divorcing and separating couples. I imagine the model could work in that area, but what you see on screen there, we've had a lot of success with all of the areas that you see up there. Where can you see a case in action? Okay, well, you can go to our free showcase. We'll put a link in the chat box for you. So if you want to see this model sort of working from start to finish, if you want to see what happens with Sally and Heather, and I know you do, then you can go and visit the online showcase. We'll put a link up for you so that you can see sort of that from start to finish, that dispute and the mediation and how it gets resolved. Okay, I'm not going to steal any of your time. It is Friday. You all want to get home, or you want to do whatever you're going to do if you're already at home. So that's our little contribution on the psychology of conflict. So my colleague has put up a link there. We've got a link about Reconnect. We've got a link for the Workplace Mediation Showcase. So that's a sort of an exposition of the whole model around the Sally and Heather workplace dispute. So you can take a look at that as well. Now, I've said any questions on there. Let's have a look. Oh my goodness, I've got people from all over the place. We've got South Africa, we've got India, we've got Gibraltar, we've got the Black Forest in Germany. That's a nice place to be right now. Let's have a look at some more questions. If your efforts fail, is the external mediator... Oh yeah, I got that one, did that one. Explaining what we do is a good icebreaker at the inception meeting with both people in conflict with one another. Yeah, that's a good comment, Bill. So being able to be upfront and transparent about what you do as a mediator, I think is really important. So that's a nice one. Can the mediator... So a question from Patsy. It says, can the mediators identify where champions are busy voice their observations. Where supporters are busy, voice their observations. Not sure what that means, Patsy. Maybe I'll follow that up afterwards. So let's have a look at some upcoming webinars. We have got one that's right on the button. Look at this. So resolving return to work conflicts, 21st of August. So just around the corner now, as people start to embrace the new normal, workplace conflict, as people come back into the workplace. In this climate, you know, we're going to get disputes. So there's going to be stuff around people coming off furloughing. There may be stuff to do with discrimination claims in terms of the choices that employers make about reduced workforces or how we modify workplaces when people come back in after furloughing. I think between now and October, when the furloughing scheme ends, you know, there is going to be some significant uplift in workplace unemployment disputes. So we're going to take a look at that Friday 21st of August about returning to work conflict and what we do with mediation in those settings. And then the other one is in September, we're talking about business boardroom and business to business conflict. So a large part of you know, what I do these days, along with the medical disputes and a lot of team disputes I do as well personally, is business boardroom and business to business conflict. So we've got a big panel of mediators out there who are currently doing a lot of online mediations, more than being out there. And again, we've had a bit of an uplift in the amount of business and boardroom conflict, so I thought it'd be a good time to talk about what that is. So, you know, boardrooms and businesses are far more effective when we have the right degree of constructive conflict. So you'll hear about our work in that area and about how we informally resolve disputes within organisations. That's pretty well me done. So do keep in touch. You can like and subscribe our YouTube. You can follow us on Twitter, visit our LinkedIn page, UK Mediation, or check out our Facebook. This webinar will be on YouTube. If you want to share it with anybody, please do. Thank you very, very much for your questions. It's been valuable to have that bit of dialogue with you. We would look forward to seeing you on our next webinar. And so for today, thanks for attending. Thanks for participating. Have a great weekend. Stay safe. Good luck.